Hello, everyone. Welcome to this very special webinar entitled Supporting Your Child's Gender Expression and Exploration, hosted by the New York City Department of Education and Gender Spectrum. This webinar is geared toward parents of K-8 students in New York City public schools, but we welcome anyone else who's joining us tonight. My name is Kimberly Shannon. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I'm the Gender Equity Coordinator at the New York City Department of Education. I'm really pleased to introduce to you our facilitator tonight, Lisa Kenny, Executive Director of the organization Gender Spectrum, who will be leading this webinar tonight. Gender Spectrum is a leading national organization providing education, training, and consultation on issues related to gender and youth. And Lisa has years of experience talking to parents about the very topics that we'll hear about tonight. So without further ado, I want to turn it over to Lisa Kenny.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for letting me come into your homes and workplaces this evening and talk a little bit about gender. So our goals for today are just to share some basic concepts to help you think about gender and to demonstrate some ways in which children and youth see gender communicated in our society on an ongoing basis, and also somewhat a little bit differently than we tend to see in our workplace and other places. We're going to discuss some common terms and the ways in which understandings of gender are changing. And finally, we'll talk about a couple of suggestions on talking with your child about gender. One thing, and I spend my whole day thinking and talking about gender, and I'm often confused about some of the things that I'm hearing in sort of our society's discussion about gender. And so if you're feeling confused and unsure about a number of things, please know you're not alone. It can be very confusing. And I hope that by the end of this, you'll have a little more information, but certainly there's a lot more to be understood. And at the very end, Kimberly and I have some resources and other things that you can look to for any questions that you have after the end of today's session. So let's go ahead and get started. And the first thing that we like to do is talk about dimensions of gender. And the reason is that while many of us sort of start with bodies, and when we think about sex, while gender includes sex, it also includes other things related to our bodies, but also other dimensions of gender beyond our body. So each one of these dimensions I'm going to talk about just very briefly. And just one thing to keep in mind is that while each of these dimensions relates to one another, they're also independent in some ways of one another. And so that's where some of the confusion can come about. And hopefully I'll be able to address some of that. So let's get into the dimensions of gender, and let's begin with the body. And as I said, that's where most people begin, but it's also where most people end the discussion around gender. And I'm going to talk about that and then go on to some other aspects. So while our body includes our sex, it also includes our experience of our body and how society genders bodies and interacts with us. And let me give an example of that. So most people, when we think about bodies, we really think about genitals, frankly, and that is the sex that we get assigned at birth. So a doctor or nurse takes a quick look, and that's what gets on our birth certificate. But in addition to that, our body defines our sort of masculinity or femininity also based on different aspects or characteristics of our body. And some of those are sort of obvious and they're related to our bodies, like, the size of somebody's breasts related to femininity or other characteristics like that. But there's also some funny societal things that we have where, and this came up in the recent election cycle, where people were talking about the size of a person's hands being related to the inference being to their genitals, and also by an additional inference is related to how masculine that person is. And so it's not just sort of the facts of our bodies, if you will, or what our genitals are, but it's all the ways in which we have these ideas of femininity or masculinity based on our bodies. So that's the first dimension of gender, is our bodies. The second dimension of our body is our identity, which is really our internal, our personal sense of gender. It's who we know ourselves to be internally. And sometimes that can seem a little abstract and hard to get our heads around, but it really is that internal knowing of ourselves as either a boy as a child, or a girl, or neither, or both, or something in between. It's just that internal sense of who we know ourselves to be. And sometimes that shows up, for example, if somebody identifies as a girl and they see themselves as a girl, but they might be a particular kind of girl, somebody who's a tomboy, or a girl that identifies as sort of a really girly girl. and really loves these things that are sort of typically associated with being a girl. And so that identity is the second dimension of our gender, and it's really that internal sense of who we know ourselves to be. The third dimension of gender I want to talk about today is expression, and that's how we present our gender in the world, but also how society and culture and community and family perceives and interacts with, and also tries to shape our gender. So it's the gender that we see when we're out in the world, and it's how people also interpret our gender. Either somebody looks at us and says, oh yes, they're either a man or they're a woman or a boy or a girl, and how they interact with us based on that assumption. So those three things, these three dimensions of gender, again, are separate and distinct, and it's helpful to think of them that way, but of course, they relate to one another, and they shape one another and influence one another. So those are the dimensions of gender, and one question that parents often have is, when is a gender identity established? When does somebody know? And what we know is, according to the American Academy of Pediatrics, by age 4, most children have a stable sense of their gender identity. And that's true for all kids, regardless of their gender identity. So the thing that gets a little bit challenging is if your gender falls sort of outside the expectation of what society has, then it may take a little longer to understand. You may feel different. It may not be quite clear how you're different, and you may not have language for what that difference looks like. But there is a sense, and it's a stable sense of your gender beginning at age 4, and that's true for all kids. Let's talk about a couple of gender identities, because this is where some confusion can come in. And this is truly a very small sampling. I mean, I think there's new gender identities being created every day. I'm reminded of when Facebook first came out with their gender identities, and first there were 52, and people thought, how is that possible that there are 52? And pretty quickly, Facebook had to come back and say, hey, we realized we didn't actually have enough. And in fact, they provided a custom option. So this is really a place where identities are evolving, and the language around identities is really evolving. But let's talk about a couple basic things. Generally, we take identities and classify them in two general categories. One is binary, meaning it's one of two different options, and then non-binary, which I'll talk about next, which is outside of the idea that there's two to choose from. So gender binary is this idea of two gender identities that are possible, male and female. And then cisgender is just simply if your gender identity is the same or aligns with your assigned sex at birth, then what we call that is cisgender. So it's the same as your assigned sex. If your gender identity is different from the sex that you were assigned on birth, if it's different than what's on your birth certificate, then there are binary identities that are called then transgender. Now, when we get to the next slide, I'll say that actually it's a little more complex, because some people, when talking about being transgender, mean it in a non-binary way. But there are people who identify as transgender, and it really means that their gender that they identify with is across from the sex that they were assigned at birth. And in that case, it's a binary identity. As I mentioned, there's also non-binary identities, and this is really, truly just a handful of some that you may hear every once in a while, either as you're listening to kids talk or you might hear it in the media. Bigender is just simply any two gender identities. Gender fluid is something that actually is a very common one, and it really means it's an identity that changes. Gender queer, again, one that you might hear, is just it can either be an identity, it can be an expression, but it can also just be an umbrella term for anybody that doesn't fit sort of society's ideas of what gender should be. And then transgender, as I mentioned, can be a binary identity, but it can also be a non-binary identity, meaning that this person does not align with the sex that they were assigned at birth, but they also don't just see themselves as across from that. They actually identify themselves in some other way, and those are non-binary identities. A different category, which you don't hear as much about, but it's an important one to know as well, which is agender. And an agender person simply does not identify with any particular gender at all. So that's a separate gender identity, if you will, but it's called agender. Now, one of the really confusing things that tends to come up is that we think that gender is not only just about the sex that somebody's assigned at birth, but it's really easy to get it confused with sexual orientation. And oftentimes when people are thinking about sort of elementary school kids, there's some confusion thinking that when we're talking about gender, we're talking about sex and sexual orientation. But in fact, we're not. We're talking about very different things. And so one of the easiest ways I think to think about this is that gender is personal, but sexual orientation is interpersonal. So sexual orientation has to do with who is it that I'm attracted to, and that attraction could be sexual attraction or it could be a romantic attraction to others. So it's important to remember that gender and sexual orientation are not the same thing. Because sexual orientation, the definition or the identity I have around sexual orientation is related to my gender and the gender of the other person, those two things can sometimes then get confused to be the same. But it is really important to make sure that it's a distinction and that gender is personal and sexual orientation is really interpersonal. One other thing when we're talking about that children come to a gender identity by age 4 is that, it's hard to remember that almost from the moment a child is born, we're really talking about gender and we're instilling those ideas very early and continuing ongoing. And of course, kids see this everywhere. It's also important to note that these ideas change over time. Of course, today we sort of assume that blue is for boys and pink is for girls, and that's everywhere in the products and the clothing and all the toys that kids have access to. But in fact, it wasn't really that long ago, about 100 years ago, that it was just the opposite, that red being a much stronger color was for boys, and blue was seen as a much softer color and was more appropriate for girls. And so, of course, these ideas change over time. And it's important to remember that because, of course, we see this regularly, but we tend to think that these rules are much more entrenched around gender than they really are. We also see these in lots of products, as I was just mentioning. And here's one of my sort of the ones that maybe just make you really pause and think about it, that even a rattle for a 3 to 18-month-old, we already see the ways in which we're taking these gender stereotypes and these gender ideas, and we're creating products, and we're trying to get people to begin to understand how we differentiate between a child's gender. So we see the diamond ring rattle for a sweet baby girl, and we see a saw rattle for a busy baby boy, and already beginning at age 3 months, we're beginning to gender kids. We also do it in these other ways around products and services, and this is another example of that where you see we're marketing telescopes, which really shouldn't be sort of gender-based, and yet you see the most powerful, sort of real scientific, 525 times magnification telescope being sold there. And then, of course, we go down from 525 to 250, and finally to 90 times magnification, and that telescope is in pink, and clearly it's really essentially a toy. And the messages that says around girls and their interest in science, and it really looks like they're just sort of playing at it versus somebody else who's really serious about it. So those are all the ways in which we continue to communicate and instill ideas about gender and our expectations for different genders and how they're supposed to operate and what they're supposed to be interested in. We like to think in terms really of patterns versus rules, and as a helpful way to think about it. And children often want to take something that they see and make a rule out of it, and we just try to remind them that mostly it's around patterns, that while many children that identify as girls like certain things, there are some girls who do not, and there are some kids that identify as boys who do like it. So patterns versus rules can be a really helpful way to think about it, and also to see how our society changes over time. And the pictures I have there are just simply to remind us that there was a time, actually not that long ago, that men didn't wear things like earrings. And today, of course, that's just really common. And we don't think anything at all of a man that wears an earring. It wasn't that long ago that not many women, of course some did, but not many women wore tattoos. And of course now increasingly more and more girls and women have tattoos. And the same is true now, and it's not uncommon that you'll see guys who wear dresses and skirts. And again, that was sort of really uncommon and sort of unheard of until more recent, unless it was a cultural preference. And so, but we see that much more now. And again, so while many of the people that wear skirts and dresses identify as girls, there are also those that identify as boys and men who also wear dresses and skirts. So it's a difference between patterns and rules, and sometimes that's really helpful, especially in talking with kids, but frankly also for all the rest of us too. So in talking with your kids about gender, one of the things that we find is really important is to first consider your gender story, because we tend to focus a lot more on the gender, what's going on with our kids' gender, and wondering how do we talk with them about it. But we really find it helpful to first consider your gender story. So I'd like to give you a few things to think about, a few questions that you can think about that will help you think about your own gender, that may also then help you when you begin to talk with your child about their gender. So a few of these questions are here, which is, growing up, did you think of yourself as a boy, a girl, both, or neither? And when you came to recognition, when did you do that? What messages did you receive from those around you about gender? And how were kids who didn't fit into expectations regarding gender treated by others? How have your race, ethnicity, faith, and class, all those things influenced your gender? And how would you describe your gender, taking into account all three dimensions? And then finally, how has your understanding of gender influenced how you parent your children? And those are all just questions that are helpful to help you think about your own gender. But to the degree that you've thought about that or can think about that, it can also help you as you begin to think about talking with your child about gender. So let's skip to that now. So 5 tips for talking to your kids. And again, this isn't all of them, but some helpful ways to get started. And the first thing is to just simply assess how open your child will be to discussing gender and the best conditions for this conversation. And this can vary a great deal depending on the age of your child, and especially the difference between elementary age kids and middle school. And one of the things I find best, for example, with my kids, I can sometimes get a conversation to happen in the car that I can't get if we're sitting at the dinner table. Or I can do it while we're sitting on the couch watching a television program. We can talk for a few minutes here and there about some things in a way that might feel too confrontational or something in a different context. So in thinking about your child, just think about the best conditions where this conversation might happen. It can also be helpful, and the second tip here, about finding opportunities to talk about gender in non-personal ways. So especially as you want to broach the discussion and sort of think what they might say, part of it is just sort of saying, hey, did you see that story or this story in the news? Maybe again, depending on the age of the child. Or, hey, I noticed that your friend had this really beautiful outfit on. What did you think of it? It might come up at Halloween time, which is, of course, a time when lots of kids are trying on some fun things that don't necessarily conform to sort of typical gender expectations. So that's a helpful way to talk with your kids. The third thing I mentioned earlier is to just share personal insights about your own gender story. And that may then provide an opening for your child to present some information about their own gender that they may not have thought to share with you before. Communicating openness and acceptance of gender diversity, if that's true for you. If it's not, that's okay too, but maybe indicate that you're wanting and interested in learning more. Your child will pick up on whether or not this is a conversation that you're open to, and might even assume, unless they've heard from you otherwise, that you may not want to. If you think that may be the case, either because of something that's been said in the past or because of some other perception you think your child has of you, it's really important to be proactive in opening up the conversation. And certainly talking about things that, your openness or your willingness to learn can be a great way to open up that door for communication. And finally, if at first they don't seem responsive, really don't give up. Sometimes they're trying to figure out, are you really serious about having this conversation? And they're going to maybe, sort of give you little bits here and there, but they're going to wait and see what happens. It doesn't mean they're not interested. It may simply mean they're not quite sure what you really want to know and how much you want to have the conversation. So be willing to bring it up a few different times and continue to bring up, different aspects, again, to some of these other tips, and to see whether or not they respond in some cases better than others. But don't give up. You might be surprised that eventually the child that you really thought wasn't going to talk to you about it really will. So those are the 5 tips that we have for you for today about talking with your kids. And just to let you know that there's other resources and other things that we at Gender Spectrum are here to help you with. We have an online lounge, which is trainings and programming, and we have our website. We have a couple books that we've written, so please feel free to look at anything we have. We have a conference and a film on gender inclusive schools that's for elementary schools you may find helpful. and certainly parent workshops and other things. So there's lots of resources. Please feel free to come to the website and find some other things that will give you additional tips and resources for having these conversations. Also, equally importantly, I'll let Kimberly talk about New York City resources and some of the other national resources that exist for you as well.
Thank you so much, Lisa. I do encourage everyone to go onto Gender Spectrum's website. They have some excellent resources for parents, other family members, and for students themselves, or children themselves. So I really recommend checking that out. But in addition to that, I want to share with you some information about New York City specific resources for families who want to support their gender expansive children. So first, I want to encourage you to go to schools.nyc.gov/pride. There you'll find a web page full of links and information. And you'll find a link to our Respect for All webpage, where you can learn more about the Department of Education's policies and practices regarding bullying. You'll also find a longer list of resources that can be beneficial to you and your child on our Pride page. So I highly recommend that you check that out. And we list some excellent organizations, and I will not be able to cover all of them in the slides or the time that we have here. So please do go to the page, check that out. I highly, highly recommend that you read over our transgender and gender nonconforming student guidelines, which we just updated this year. These will inform you of helpful definitions and terminology, as well as the Department of Education's policies addressing discrimination and harassment, privacy rights, information on student records, sports and physical education, restroom and locker room accessibility, dress code rules, and more. So if you're looking for organizations, PFLAG NYC has an amazing Trans Families Project, which is a group for parents of transgender children. They also have Stepping Stones, a parents group and simultaneous play group for parents of younger children who are gender nonconforming. The LGBT Community Center is a great place to go for counseling and other resources. The Ackerman Institute's Gender and Family Project has play groups for gender expansive children, support groups for parents of adolescents 14 and older, a support group for gender expansive adolescents, and a sibling group. They also offer counseling and coaching for families. The Hetrick Martin Institute provides programming for LGBTQ youth between 13 and 24. I know that this webinar is geared toward parents of younger children, but in case you have children who are between the ages of 13 and 24, it's a really fantastic program. It's housed in the same building as the Harvey Milk School. And if you have a child in that, if you have a child in that age range, then I really recommend that you check them out. The programming includes academic enrichment, arts and culture, health and wellness, counseling, and services for homeless youth, and job readiness. So they have a number of things for children that age range. I also want to note some national resources. So those include the Trevor Project, which focuses on LGBTQ suicide prevention, GLSEN, 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 which is an excellent resource for educators and schools. The Trans Youth Equality Foundation, which has a helpful list of legal resources for parents. And then this wonderful guide, Families in Transition, which is actually by the Central Toronto Youth Services. And it goes over the process of supporting your child during transition, including questions to ask your child, tips for supporting your own well-being during this time, and how to tell others, information on hormones and surgery, and more. So even though that's from Toronto, that's actually a really great resource that we recommend that you check out. I do want to open it up for questions, but I just want to remind everyone that I am here. So if you want to go to the next slide, the contact information. I am here. I'm the Gender Equity Coordinator, again, at the New York City Department of Education. And you can reach me via kshannon@schools.nyc.gov. And that's if you have any questions about supporting your child in school, in relation to school. We also have an LGBT liaison, Jared Fox, who was unable to be with us tonight, but is also an excellent resource for learning how to best support your child at school. So if you have any questions, you can contact either of us. And I also want to remind you of all those excellent resources that I just that I just talked about are going to be helpful in answering a lot of the questions that you're hopefully thinking about right now. I know that this presentation is really just skimming the surface. So we do hope that this is a helpful start for many of you, but I hope that most of all, I hope that this really got you thinking about how to support your child, whether your child is transgender, gender nonconforming or not, just to understand gender and to think about how gender affects all of us and our children. I do want to open it up for questions. So in order to submit a question, you can leave them in the comment box. And I believe that we also got some questions via email. So I'm going to read one of those questions right now. So a president of a PTA asks, is there any research about using gender as a management tool to divide the class? So that's a really interesting question, and we get questions about that type of about that topic a lot. So I just want to encourage you again to read our transgender guidelines. The reason that is because we actually do have a section on segregating genders. So the guideline that we provide is that gender segregation should only occur in cases where it serves a clear pedagogical purpose. And so then in those cases, students should be allowed to participate in activities based on their gender identity. If your student is transgender, then they should be allowed to participate in activities based on the gender that they identify with. So, but for the most part, we recommend that gender segregation should not be occurring unless there's that clear pedagogical purpose. So that is, I think, what I have to say on that topic. I'm not sure, Lisa, if you want to add anything on that.
No, I mean, I think you're out, the guidelines that you have are terrific. And I think that one of the things that we often forget is, a lot of excellent teachers, you're hurrying about, and gender is one of those easy ways to quickly divide. It's also just a reminder that it's more creative and kind of fun for kids to divide up on other kinds of things. And sometimes it's just that reminder how important it is to find other ways, and whether it's, let's line up by cat people or dog people, or, whatever it is, kids can really have a good time. And so it's not only helpful for those kids that may not know which line they would go to if we divide them up by boys and girls lines, but it's also just frankly a lot more fun to kind of mix it up a little bit and find other ways to get kids to do the kinds of things we want to do from a classroom management perspective.
Yeah, and I do just want to highlight that when we refer to that clear pedagogical purpose, we're talking about, if you are having a female empowerment group, something that refers specifically to STEM for girls, because there's underrepresentation of STEM, for girls, or underrepresentation of girls in the STEM fields. That would be a case where it would be okay. But if you're just separating lines by gender, if a teacher is separating lines by gender, then that kind of goes to that, that point that that Lisa's talking about. So we want to just try to keep that in mind, and we want to make sure that we are supporting our non-binary students and supporting all of our students. So that's kind of, more of a classroom perspective. But if you have any questions about that and what's going on in your student's classroom, then you can always contact me. So contact myself or Jared Fox. It looks like we have another question. So a parent asks, is there a list of NYC therapists who specialize in working with transgender children and groups for parents to receive information? So I do want to highlight, I believe we're going to be archiving this webinar on Gender Spectrum's website. And that link is it genderspectrum.org/NYC schools? Someone call me.
That's right. Yep. genderspectrum.org/NYC schools.
Great. So we're going to be archiving this. So if you want to watch it again, you can go back to that slide where we talk about those and the New York City specific resources. And all of those resources that I mentioned either have counseling on site, or they will refer you to a counselor that is appropriate for your child, and in many cases for you. And I get really excited about the Gender and Family Project's sibling group as well. So whether it's group counseling or one-on-one counseling that you're looking for, we definitely recommend going to these organizations. And again, these organizations that we listed here are really just skimming the surface of what's available in New York City. And so I do want to emphasize that, in the New York City Schools Pride page, we list a number of other resources. So I encourage you to look at that.
One other thing too, Kimberly, we might want to add, and it's unfortunate we didn't remember to put on the list, but there is a conference in that area. This year it's in the Newark area, but certainly right outside New York, called Gender Conference East, and that is also really a wonderful place for kids to come and be with all other kinds of kids, and also for parents and grandparents and extended family to come and get all kinds of information around gender. So there's quite a bit of information, and we'll add that, I think, to our website page, so that when people are looking for resources, but that's a terrific resource as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah, that's an excellent conference, and again, if you want to, if you have questions about that conference, then go online, check it out. But that is a conference that, while I am new to this area, my colleague Jared Fox has been to that conference, has presented at that. So it's a really excellent place to go to for kids, and then we as well attend that conference. So a parent emailed, I've read about a number of children who change schools when transitioning. But how common is it to have a child stay in the same school when transitioning? And so, the good news is that these are both great options, and we have a number of students who, choose to do either option. So I can understand there's a lot of pressure when a student wants to transition. They can feel like there's a lot of pressure, changing pronouns and whatnot, and it might feel good to just start anew. But we also our transgender guidelines go over the process of supporting a student who is transitioning. And so there are a number of ways to do that. And I think the best part about it is that we do encourage schools to have the student really guide that transition and tell the administrator how they want to transition, whether it's with a letter home, or whether it's having a conversation with the other students and how they're going to talk about it, how they're going to answer questions, with the staff and the students. We've seen some really wonderful and well-received transitions occur in the same school. So I definitely encourage thinking about that as an option. And Lisa, I believe that you know of some resources as well for learning about best practices when transitioning in relation to school.
Well, we have a couple of resources that parents might find helpful. And I think that the first one, we do have a guide that we wrote with HRC and NCLR and the ACLU called Schools in Transition. That might be helpful. But I think even more so than that, we have a document. It's on our website. And if you can't find it, please just email us and we'll make sure we get it to you, which is called the Gender Support Plan. And what it does is it's a document, it's really comprehensive, that takes all these different aspects of school and helps the parent, and potentially, depending on the age of the child with the school staff, to sit down and really look at all the different aspects of the school environment and experience and come up with a plan about how to support their child's gender. And again, that's whether the child is, regardless of the child's identity, it's just a support plan around that child's gender. And it takes into account all the various things that go on, and I think it can be really helpful. And I think to your point, Kimberly, lots of times parents assume that the child's going to have to change schools, and they worry, that maybe the kids are not going to be able to make this transition with their child. They're concerned about their child's well-being. In our experience, and I believe this is borne out in your experience as well, is that actually kids really tend not to be the problem in the school. Kids really tend to be pretty flexible. And once they are given some information about how that child sees themselves, and it really is helpful to have this communication plan around it to know how that's going to happen. But our experience is really that oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes it really is very successful for that child to remain in their same school. Of course, if it isn't, it's great that New York City has a means of dealing with that, but it's really important that parents can know that oftentimes actually kids do really well doing a social transition in their same school.
Great, thank you. So this question, I think I am going to send this question to you, Lisa. So it's actually My son likes to wear girls' clothes. Does that mean that he's transgender?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I hear that. And, the answer is it doesn't necessarily mean that they're transgender. And again, if we go back to those three dimensions, and we talked about bodies and identity and expression, it could be that your child was, has a male body, if you will, or was assigned a male sex and identifies as a male. But as we were talking about in the patterns and rules section, somebody likes to wear skirts or dresses. So it doesn't mean that they are transgender. What it may mean is they just think they look great or they're comfortable or anything else that why girls or women find them to be comfortable if they do. It may mean, though, that if you notice it as something that if in addition to what they're wearing, they're also talking about gender in a way in terms of how they see themselves, it can also just be a great opening to talk to your child about identity questions as well, just to find out, ask to how they see themselves and what their gender expression is telling you, if it's telling you anything. So it may mean that they have an identity that is other than cisgender, than the one that their identity consistent with the sex that they were assigned at birth. And so it may mean that, but it may not. So the question is, we really don't know unless we ask our kids. And so that's the most important thing around that.
Okay, and here's a question from an online discussion group. What if my child is not saying anything about their gender, but I notice that they don't seem to fit traditional ideas of their gender? Should I talk to them about it?
I think really the best idea is for parents to talk with all their kids about gender. And I think about that only because until we do, we really don't know how our kids are interpreting the messages that they're getting. And that really is important because for many of us, and when we do this work now, thinking about our own gender story, we can find times in our own lives where we began to make decisions based on our perceptions of what was appropriate for gender. And we don't really know how our kids are hearing the message they're getting and what they're doing with that until we begin to talk to them. So I think this really is sort of, regardless of what your child's gender identity is, I think it's really helpful, or what you believe it may be. It's just a really good idea to talk to all your kids about gender and what they're seeing and what they think about it. And also to hear what they're thinking about this conversation that's probably happening among their peers in one way or another. So I think it's just a good rule of thumb for any parent with all your kids to just go ahead and talk with them.
Yeah, and I just want to add to that and say that we've hosted workshops for parents before where actually this happened last week, where one parent expressed something to the degree of like, wow, this topic really isn't that scary, because they were so scared of talking to their child about their gender identity because they thought that it meant that there were all these things that they had never thought about before, that they could not talk to their child about. But really, when it starts with talking about gender, that's something that we've all thought about, and that when we encourage that parent to think about their own gender story, the topic seemed much less intimidating to them because they realized that it's something they've talked about with their other children before, just the concept of gender and how that affects us all. So that's really a great place to start, and I think that that's what I like about the way that that Lisa presents this information as well, is that when we start to think of gender as a spectrum, when we start to think of gender as something that affects all of us, then it's much easier, I think, to open up that conversation. So I really value that input, Lisa. I also want to bring up another question that someone had asked. Does the Department of Education have any library resources, even if it's just a list, to help establish diversity of gender expression in book choices? The Department of Education encourages a number of books that support gender diversity. And if you Google "We Teach NYC," all one word, LGBT, you'll find a list of books that we recommend not only during Pride Month, but for any time. So I also highly recommend going to welcomingschools.org, which has a number of great lists for books that depict and support transgender and gender expansive young people. So that is a really important part of I think just for all of our students, making sure that we're reading books that depict diverse groups of people and that we see ourselves in. Lisa, do you want to say anything else to the topic of books, for students that talk about gender or that depict different genders?
I just think it's a really important thing, I think, with all parents with kids, because sometimes it's the way in which we're communicating with our kids that Gender diversity is okay to talk about. It's okay to recognize, and just showing different kids, I think, is really important. There are new books being created all the time. So there's certainly something out there that maybe fits your particular family better than something else. And so looking at a number of resources that are available, there's going to be something. So hang in there. If you haven't found a book that fits right or that you feel comfortable reading to your child, keep looking out, because there really are a number of things that cover the topic from a lot of different ways of looking at it.
And Lisa, I do want to also ask you to talk about your book, which I've found to be incredibly helpful. And I know a number of parents who have found that to be incredibly helpful. I'm wondering if you can talk about that and any other books that you recommend for parents if they're not looking so much for for counseling or web pages, but if they're looking more for a book that they can read to further this conversation, or to further this thought process for them.
Well, we do have two books. One is called The Transgender Child, and the other one is called The Transgender Teen. I think either one of those can be helpful. They're really written for parents. I mean, other professionals will also get a lot of hopefully good information, but that's really dealing with both transgender and non-binary kids. So if you're interested in reading more, I think both those books are really helpful. Diane Aronsoft, who's also an expert in this area and a psychologist, who just really writes in a very, sort of accessible way, has some great books on gender creative kids. And I think those books are great resources as well. So I think that that's really helpful. And I think one of the things that those books and some of the other things that we're sort of recognizing in this conversation is a lot of parents are worried about saying the wrong thing to kids. And so they're worried about saying anything at all. And Kimberly, you brought up a really great resource, or a really great comment about, talking with kids and how do we do it. And in fact, a lot of parents realize that once they get some information, they realize maybe there aren't quite as many minefields that they might step on as they try to navigate this territory with their child. And I think one of the great things that can happen in this is just opening up the discussion, and that for many kids, period, they like being able to sort of educate their parent about this, to let them know what they're hearing and what they're seeing. And it's a nice way to not only get your child to talk about what's going on and to learn how they see the world of gender, but to also then provide you with those things that you're never going to hear except they're on the playground. One of the nice things too about how quickly gender's evolving, and particularly for children and youth, is that the truth is it's really impossible to know all the things that are going on. The language is changing and new language is being created all the time. And so in some ways it takes the pressure off of us as parents. We really can just say, hey, I hear all this conversation. Can you help me understand? Or I heard this term. Can you help me know what that means? And in some ways, that's really the most important thing, because of course, as parents, what we're really trying to do is just connect to our kids and keep that communication stream open. And that's certainly true about gender, and something that, there's as much discussion about and potential misconception about. So it's a great opportunity with kids. So I think those books are helpful. And I think, there are some other great resources we have listed on our site, which I want to make sure I know we don't have a lot of time left, so I won't go into those, but I think there are a lot of things that both on your website and ours that might be a good reference point. And if somebody's looking for something in particular, please don't hesitate to send an email to info@genderspectrum.org and let us know what it is that you're looking for, and we'll be happy to try to help you find that.
Last question, Lisa. I was just thinking, we've mentioned, a number of gender spectrum resources, and I was wondering if you could speak about the Gender Spectrum Lounge.
Thanks. I appreciate that. Yeah, we actually run a lot of programming to help parents and also for kids to try to understand different aspects of what's going on around gender. In addition to the programming that we do online, which you can find in a number of places, including our site, but also our YouTube channel and other things, we run a number of groups for national call-in groups. So we have a Spanish-speaking group for parents and grandparents that people can use to connect with other parents across the country. We have a grandparents group. We've got a group that we run for dads. Dads tend to have maybe their own process and the questions that come up for them. And so there's a group of dads that get together and talk about it. And there's also, we have a middle school program. So for this audience, if your child is just questioning gender or has some sort of gender identity or expression that falls outside of society's expectations, and they would like to just talk with other kids, maybe about gender, but maybe about other things. I think it's not uncommon for those kids to spend as much time showing their pets and talking about what happened that day in school and a lot of other things, and then sort of segueing over to gender whenever they feel like it. But I think, for middle school students, that can be an important resource as well. So we certainly have a lot of programming online, but we also run a number of other national call-in and other kinds of video groups and other things like that people may find helpful. And so please feel free to check it out.
Great. Thank you so much, Lisa. And so with that, Lisa, if you could go again to the contact us slide at the end. So with that, I just want to, again, say that I really hope that this conversation got you thinking. I hope that you have some of your own questions now for yourself, for your children, and, just about gender. As a greater topic. And so I think that we've given you some resources to check out. We've given you some great tips for talking to your kids. We've given you some more ways to think about gender. And so if you have any questions, either about supporting your child at school, then you can contact myself or Jared. If you have any questions for Gender Spectrum, then I've put their website there. I just want to say thank you for joining us today. This was a really special event, and I hope that we can build this relationship and do more things collaboratively in the future. And so I hope to hear from you, and have a great night.
Thanks, everyone.